He slammed the gavel with force. $1,000, contempt. The courtroom gasped. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't flinch. No raised voice, no shaking hands. Just a steady gaze that cut through the marble silence like a scalpel. Judge Randall Forrester thought he was putting her in her place. Thought he'd just silenced a politician who spoke a little too boldly, stood a little too tall. But what he didn't know was that he hadn't silenced her at all. He just lit the fuse. Because what came next wasn't outrage. It wasn't drama. It was precision. It was patience. It was a congresswoman dismantling a courtroom. Not with fury, but with facts. She didn't need to shout. She didn't even need to move. She just made the law speak louder than any gavel ever could. This is the story of how one judge tried to humiliate AOC in front of a packed courtroom and ended up questioning everything he thought he knew about power, truth, and who really owns the room. And while the names, settings, and moments have been dramatized for storytelling purposes, the emotions, the silencing, the resistance, the quiet strength that refuses to back down are all very real. This is fiction grounded in truth. And once you hear what happened next, you'll never forget it. Contempt, $1,000. The room didn't breathe, but she didn't blink. The courtroom wasn't hot. Not exactly, but it was warm in the way that made shirt collars feel too tight and jacket linings feel like traps. The hum of an aging ceiling fan echoed overhead, steady but useless, like a peacekeeper in a room where tension didn't need sound to build. Men in gray suits adjusted their cuffs. A woman 2 rows back tugged at her pearls, eyes darting from the judge to the defense table. A high school student, credentials pinned crookedly to her chest, scribbled furiously in a reporter's notebook, the tip of her pen leaving tiny dots in place of words. It was one of those rooms where everyone knew something was about to happen, even if they didn't know what. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood at the center of it. She wore no robe, no congressional pin, just a dark blazer, open at the collar, and a single binder in her hands, thick with printed documents and tabs in every color. No teleprompter, no entourage, just her, and the law, and him. Judge Randall Forrester sat high behind the bench, posture straight as a rifle barrel, jaw set like concrete. He was known in the circuit as the Wall, not because he was unmovable, but because people usually broke themselves trying. He had no tolerance for dramatics, no patience for politics in his courtroom, and certainly no fondness for Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. Yet here she was. "I cite the First Amendment," AOC said, her voice calm, unwavering, "which not only protects speech, but prevents this court, any court, from punishing expression simply because it makes someone uncomfortable." She turned a page slowly. Her tone didn't rise, it deepened. "That includes the right to peaceably assemble on publicly accessible property for the purpose of protest, a right that was not waived and not violated until, bang, the gavel struck hard, not once, twice. "Ms. Ocasio-Cortez," Judge Forrester said, voice like glass under pressure, "this court will not tolerate activist rhetoric disguised as legal argument." A beat of silence. No one moved. Even the ceiling fan seemed to hold its breath. "This is a motion hearing," he continued, "not a campaign rally." AOC raised her eyes but not her eyebrows. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, "this is the Constitution." I'm quoting its exact language. If that's activism, then the problem isn't the words, it's the ears. A sharp intake of breath from someone in the second row. Another pen stopped mid-scratch. The judge's lips thinned to a line. "Contempt," he said. $1,000. Payable immediately or by the close of business today. He didn't even look at her when he said it. Gasps. Quiet ones. The kind people try to swallow but can't. A man near the back muttered, "Did he just fine her for citing the Bill of Rights?" AOC didn't move, didn't flinch. Her binder didn't shake in her hand. She simply adjusted one paperclip, then looked up. "May the court provide its reasoning," she said, "so that the basis of the fine can be entered into the record in case an appellate review is required." The judge blinked, not because of her words, but because of how she said them. No anger, no outrage, just structure. calm, measured. "You're bordering on insolence," he snapped. "And you," she replied, her tone still even, "are bordering on suppressing a legal defense." The air seemed to crackle, not loudly but electrically. Journalists leaned forward. A young man in a cheap blazer whispered to his neighbor, "She's not backing down." "Why isn't she backing down?" Forrester shifted in his seat. He didn't respond right away. For a second, just 1 second, he didn't look like the wall. He looked like a man who had just placed his full weight on a foundation and felt it give slightly beneath him. For a moment, no one moved. Not the court clerk, not the bailiff, not even the interns clutching their legal pads like life preservers. The weight of the fine hadn't just landed on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It had landed on the room. But she stood perfectly still. She didn't wince. She didn't sigh. She simply placed one finger against the edge of her binder, as if marking her place in the story she wasn't finished telling. She lifted her eyes to the bench, her tone still smooth, neutral, without the slightest tremble. "Your Honor," she said, "so that the record is complete, I respectfully request the court's rationale for the contempt ruling. In the event appellate review is necessary, the basis must be preserved." The words weren't confrontational. They were surgical, intentional, lined with precision rather than emotion. It wasn't a protest. It was procedure. And that was what made it so dangerous. Judge Forrester's mouth twitched. Not a smile, not quite a frown. More like the corner of a man's pride tugging against something he hadn't expected to encounter. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the carved wood, and narrowed his gaze. "Don't get clever with me, Congresswoman." The way he said it, the extra weight on the word Congresswoman, wasn't lost on anyone. It wasn't about her role. It was about his courtroom and her refusal to shrink in it. AOC didn't react. No retort, no smug smile. She didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she simply turned a page in her binder and waited, not with patience, but with control. She gave the silence space to breathe. The room, which only moments ago had pulsed with shock, now felt like it was holding its breath, watching a game unfold where only one player knew the rules. "I'm not being clever," she replied evenly. "I'm being thorough." He blinked, just once. But it was the blink of a man who'd expected a push and found a mirror instead. A moment earlier, he had been confident, certain he could cow her with authority, with ritual, with punishment. But she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't rallied the room. She hadn't played his game. She'd changed it. The court reporter resumed typing, the soft staccato echoing like distant footsteps in a hallway. Somewhere near the back, a journalist lowered her phone and whispered, "This isn't going how he thought it would." Another nodded, still typing. Forrester sat back slowly, his hands clasped in front of him, elbows widening as if to reclaim physical space. But something in his eyes shifted. A flicker. He was still angry, but beneath it, something far more vulnerable had emerged. Calculation. He was beginning to understand she hadn't come unprepared. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to document every misstep he made. She wasn't being defiant. She was being deliberate. And worse, he realized with a chill, she was winning the room without ever having to take it. He cleared his throat and looked down at his notes. But for a moment, the page didn't move. His pen didn't write. Because behind the stern jaw and judicial frown, the question was already forming in his mind. Had he just picked the wrong fight, with the wrong woman, in front of all the wrong witnesses? And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was still standing, still silent, still unflinching. From the very back row, seated on a bench that creaked every time someone shifted their weight, Nico sat frozen, shoulders hunched, pen half poised above his legal pad. He hadn't written anything in 5 full minutes, not because he didn't know what to write, but because he wasn't sure if words would be enough. His job as a summer intern was supposed to be observation, quiet, neutral, invisible. But this wasn't just observation. This was witnessing. The courtroom felt like a sealed jar, the air thick with a kind of pressure that didn't come from temperature or sound, but from anticipation. Something was building, and everyone could feel it. The judge's bench, once towering and absolute, seemed smaller now, not physically, but symbolically. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't pounded a fist. And yet somehow she had managed to change the very geometry of the room. Outside the tall windows, sunlight pushed against the glass, like it too wanted in. Beyond the courthouse steps, Nico could see blurred shapes, figures moving, signs raised, soft shadows of slogans swaying in the breeze. Every so often, a gentle thump tapped against the glass. Protest signs. He couldn't read the words from here, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Presence, persistence. Inside, silence still reigned. The judge had retreated into his papers, his face taut but no longer entirely composed. AOC stood with her binder at her side, not reading, not speaking, simply waiting. Her stillness wasn't passive, it was strategic. Nico could see it now. She wasn't a witness or a guest in that courtroom. She had claimed space, and the space had responded. He glanced toward the defense table. 6 people sat beside her. Quiet, ordinary faces. A teacher, a college student, a postal worker. People whose names had never trended, whose voices had never filled a room like this one. And yet they were here because they had dared to speak, dared to sit, dared to be visible. And in return, the system had responded the way it so often did, with handcuffs and paperwork, citations and silence. But today the silence felt different, not oppressive, charged, like something waiting to break. One of the protesters, a woman in her 40s, with paint-flecked fingernails and eyes that had clearly seen too many apologies, turned toward AOC. She didn't say anything, but Nico saw the way her shoulders eased just slightly, as if, for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was on trial for existing. Nico didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until he exhaled, soft, shaky. He scribbled one line in the margin of his pad before he could forget it. She doesn't fight for attention. She fights for air. Across the courtroom, AOC leaned slightly toward the woman seated beside her, an aide with wide eyes and a hand clenched too tightly around a pen. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but Nico heard it. "He brought a hammer," she murmured, eyes still on Forrester. "He thinks I'm a nail." The aide blinked. Nico swallowed. She wasn't being poetic. She was being prophetic. Because if this court was built to crush, if it had done so 1,000 times before, without consequence, then today, for the first time, the hammer had found something it couldn't bend, couldn't crack, couldn't silence. Not yet, not her. The hum in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Bronx office wasn't comforting. It came from a fluorescent ceiling panel that flickered just enough to be noticed, but not enough to warrant fixing, at least not this week. The walls bore faint outlines of old posters long since peeled away, and the ones that remained were curling at the corners. Climate justice, student debt reform. One from her first campaign, faded at the edges like a memory trying to hold on. Her desk was an organized mess, stacked legal pads with half-torn pages, a chipped ceramic mug of pens that no longer worked, and a blinking monitor that hadn't responded to the space bar in nearly 2 hours. Outside the second-floor window, the Bronx bustled, vendors calling out lunchtime specials in 2 languages, buses sighing at curbs, kids dragging backpacks too big for their frames. But inside it was just her, the low whir of a fan, and the call that hadn't stopped buzzing in her hand. She finally answered on the 3rd ring. "Alexandria!" The voice on the other end cracked from distance, or stress. She knew it instantly. Luis Calderon, former student organizer, now something between a policy researcher and full-time fire stomper. "Luis," she said, already sitting up straighter. "What's wrong?" "They arrested 6 people outside Northern Star Energy's Midtown office yesterday," he said, wasting no time. "Unlawful assembly, trespassing. You know the playbook." AOC reached for a pen that barely worked, dragging it across a yellow pad. "Peaceful protest?" "Very. No damage, no shouting, no spray paint. One of them was reading from a book when she got pulled up by the wrist. Video? Yeah, multiple. One's already got 20,000 views, but the quality's garbage. Filmed through a bus window." She circled the name. Northern Star Energy. Corporate. Well-connected. Notorious for overreaction. "Who are they?" she asked. The protesters? Luis exhaled. A mix: college student, retired postal worker, a high school art teacher, and Daryl Jenkins. She paused mid-scribble. Daryl, the gardener from Hunts Point? Yeah, he's got asthma. Can't stand too long. He was sitting when they took him. AOC closed her eyes briefly, running a thumb down her temple. She remembered Daryl, his hands always covered in soil, always offering cuttings from community planters. He'd shown up to 3 town halls with the same message. We don't need new buildings. We need the ones we've got to stop leaking. And the charges, she asked. Rubber stamped. Copy-paste affidavits. Officer name was Walsh, claims he gave 3 loud verbal warnings before making contact. And on the tape? Luis hesitated. You barely hear the first warning before he starts grabbing people. Of course. The same pattern she'd seen a dozen times in a dozen zip codes. The choreography of overreach, vague charges, swift force, a system that moved faster against protest signs than it ever did against injustice. She looked at her calendar, a budget briefing, a school board forum, a committee prep call, all the things that would still be there after. I'll take it, she said. Luis's voice softened. You sure? I'm sure. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just the soft click of a pen cap sliding shut. She didn't know yet how cold the courtroom would feel, how hard the gavel would come down, or how far one judge would go to silence her. But she did know one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't about 6 arrests. It was about how far the system would bend to avoid seeing itself, and how far she was willing to go to make it look. The video loaded slowly, its pixelated preview pulsing in and out of clarity like a heartbeat under stress. Alexandria sat forward in her chair, arms crossed, one finger resting on her chin, the other hovering above the spacebar. A sticker on the corner of her screen read, "Your silence won't protect you." It had faded over time, but the message was still clear. The footage was shaky, filmed vertically from inside a city bus stopped across the street. The camera tilted slightly every time the person holding the phone shifted in their seat. Traffic noise dominated the audio, muffled engines, the occasional honk, distant footsteps. But even through the chaos, the image was unmistakable. There they were, 6 protesters seated neatly on the wide stone steps outside Northern Star Energy's headquarters. No barricades, no posters, no chanting, just bodies in silence. A teacher in a floral scarf, a student with a canvas bag, an older man sitting with one hand on his chest, breathing steadily. In the middle, Marissa Elkins held a paperback book in both hands, reading aloud, not loudly but with purpose. When the oppressed speak out, not in anger, but in clarity, they threaten the very architecture of complacency. The quote floated from her lips like a candle flame held against the wind. Then from the edge of the frame, Officer Walsh appeared. No helmet, no bullhorn, no crowd control formation. Just him, his badge, and a clipboard tucked under one arm like he was taking lunch orders. He raised his hand. His mouth moved, but the sound didn't cut through. Alexandria turned the volume all the way up. She caught 3 words. You are hereby... Before the sentence dissolved beneath the street noise. Then his hand lowered, and his other moved forward, grabbing the first protester by the elbow and yanking him to his feet. The man stumbled off balance. Another officer moved in behind Walsh, cuffs already out. Marissa didn't even look up before Walsh reached her. She was halfway through a quote from Angela Davis when his hand closed around her wrist. Her book dropped to the concrete. The sound it made, soft, flat, hollow, was somehow louder than the officer's warning. Alexandria paused the footage. The frozen image showed Marissa mid-breath, mouth parted slightly, eyes still down, as if she hadn't even realized what was happening yet. A moment of stillness before the grip became motion. She rewound the clip. This time she timed it. 4 seconds. From the start of Walsh's first audible command to the physical contact with the first protester. 4 seconds. No loudspeaker. No countdown. No offer to relocate. Just muscle. She exhaled slowly through her nose and sat back. The video didn't need to go further. She'd seen enough. She had seen this pattern before. The state flexing its discomfort like a reflex. Paperwork filled out in advance. Cameras arriving too late to matter. But this time, Maybe just this time, someone had caught it in full, and now that she'd seen it, she couldn't unsee it. Her hand moved to her binder. The page where she'd started a rough sketch of her opening argument now filled with circled phrases. Public access, expressive conduct, Martin v. Stroud, and underlined 3 times in ink that had begun to bleed. The sun had dropped just low enough to paint the edge of her desk gold, catching on the rim of an empty coffee cup and the sharp corner of a paperclip that refused to stay put. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat still, arms crossed, her gaze fixed not on the blinking cursor of the half-written email in front of her, but on the notepad beside it, the one with 4 seconds underlined 3 times and circled once, like a warning bell she couldn't ignore. Behind her, the office buzzed faintly, phones ringing in distant corners, the elevator doors groaning closed, an intern arguing with the vending machine 2 floors down. Life continued. Even injustice wasn't loud all the time. Most days, it whispered. Her assistant, Lena, stood by the door holding 2 takeout containers and a face that said she already knew what Alexandria was thinking and didn't like it. "You've got committee notes to prep and a media interview in 40 minutes, Lena said carefully. "Not to mention 3,000 unanswered emails and a housing brief from yesterday you haven't touched. If you take this on..." Alexandria didn't look up. "If you take this on," Lena continued, stepping farther into the room, "you'll lose a week. Minimum." AOC let the silence answer for her. Lena sighed and set the takeout down. "This won't make headlines," she added more softly now. "It's not national. It's not even state level. They'll run a local segment and call it a day. It'll be gone in 24 hours. "It doesn't need to make headlines," Alexandria said, eyes still locked on the notepad. "It needs to make history in the courtroom." Lena didn't respond. She just watched her boss lean forward, click the pen open, and write 2 names in clean block letters: Marissa Elkins, Daryl Jenkins. "They're not suing anyone," Lena said. "There's no press conference, no speech. You're not walking into that courtroom to win a bill or swing a vote. You're walking in there with nothing but case law and principle." "Good," Alexandria replied, almost under her breath. "Then we'll find out if that's still enough." She flipped through her binder. The names of previous cases lined the margins, scrawled fast during phone calls or pulled from long-forgotten court opinions she hadn't touched since law school. Holder v. Community Network. Martin versus City of Stroud. Donovan v. Metro PD. Cases that didn't set fire to the news cycle, but quietly pushed the ground beneath it. She wasn't planning a performance. She was preparing an argument. One layered with precedent, with deliberate phrasing, with a tone sharp enough to cut but never draw blood. A wall built from the Constitution outward, cold, exact, and immovable. Lena hesitated before turning to leave. "This is a fight you can't win with charm," she said quietly. "I'm not bringing charm," Alexandria said. "I'm bringing structure." Outside, a siren wailed faintly down the avenue. Somewhere across the Bronx, a mother was probably reading a court date off a crumpled ticket. Somewhere else, a kid was watching his teacher being pulled off a protest step on his phone. The country had learned to live with the background noise of injustice, but she hadn't. She looked up at the ceiling for a long second, then stood. "Call Luis. Tell him I want the original arrest reports, badge numbers, and site maps. And I want every video, high quality or not, tagged and time-stamped by morning." Lena raised an eyebrow. "You're going all in." Alexandria nodded once. "If we're going to walk into a courtroom where power expects silence, then we better make sure the law knows how to speak." The courtroom was colder than yesterday. Not in temperature, though someone had clearly turned the air up a notch, but in mood. The chill wasn't physical, it was procedural. Icy in the way a room becomes when it stops pretending to be neutral. The bailiff stood straighter this morning, more rigid, less bored. His eyes tracked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the moment she walked in, as though trying to place what exactly about her didn't sit right. Maybe it was the confidence. Maybe it was the silence. Power doesn't like stillness unless it owns it. She sat at the defense table with her binder already open, her pen uncapped, her hands folded lightly, one over the other, neither tense nor loose. Her client sat beside her in a single line that looked more like a waiting room than a threat to civil order. Daryl Jenkins wore a too large dress shirt, his inhaler peeking from his breast pocket. Marissa Elkins, the art teacher, kept her hands in her lap, thumbs pressed tight together. The youngest among them, barely old enough to vote, avoided the judge's bench entirely, staring instead at the notepad in front of him where nothing had yet been written. They had dressed up for this, in the way people dress for things they don't understand but still respect. They had come hoping that the system might see them as citizens, not suspects, hoping that today the burden wouldn't fall on them to prove they weren't the problem. When Judge Randall Forrester entered, no one stood until the bailiff barked the command. Then the shuffle of chairs, the sudden stillness, the forced reverence. Forrester didn't look left or right. He didn't scan the room. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. Not the defendants, not AOC, not even the clerk. He simply walked with tight shoulders to the bench, sat down, adjusted his robe with one sharp tug, and stared at his docket like it might misbehave if left unattended. There was a tension to his posture, a stiffness beyond formality, the kind that belonged to someone trying not to acknowledge the last 24 hours. The fine, the refusal to back down, the way the courtroom had tilted ever so slightly on its axis yesterday and never quite righted itself. He tapped the bench twice with his knuckles. This hearing will resume now. Case number 27-8431, State v. Jenkins et al. Counsel, please proceed. His voice was clipped, clean, mechanical. Alexandria rose smoothly, her hand brushing the edge of the table. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said with a tone so level it could have been a measurement. "Before I begin, I'd like to confirm for the record that my clients are present and the defense is prepared to proceed on the motion to dismiss." Forrester nodded, though still not looking directly at her. "Confirmed." Not a word more, not a glance. The message was clear. He wasn't just trying to control the courtroom. He was trying to reclaim it. And yet the energy in the room had already shifted. Again, the reporters, the court clerks, even the gallery of observers sensed it. The cold wasn't coming from the air vents. It was coming from the bench. But the heat, quiet, unspoken, steady, was gathering at the defense table. Alexandria remained standing, hands resting lightly at her sides. No performance, no preamble, just presence. Behind her, her clients sat still, but their eyes flicked toward her, small, brief glances like people watching the only stable object in a shaking room. The bailiff shifted once more, arms crossed tight, watching her, waiting. But not because she was a threat in the way he'd been trained to look for one. He was watching because she didn't look like a threat. And somehow that made her feel like the most dangerous person in the room. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez adjusted her stance, letting her fingertips brush the edge of the defense table before lifting a page from her binder. The sheet was marked with blue tabs, yellow highlighter, and a small line in the corner that simply read, "Don't blink." She didn't intend to. "Your Honor," she began, "our motion to dismiss rests on a clear and narrow foundation, that my clients were arrested without sufficient cause, in a space functionally open to the public, while exercising constitutionally protected speech. There was no violence, no obstruction, just presence." She paused just long enough to ensure no one could call it a filibuster, then continued. "To support this, I direct the court's attention to Holder v. Community Network, 7th Circuit, 2011. In that ruling, the court found that protesters gathered outside a privately owned but publicly accessible building could not be charged with trespass when they—" "Miss Ocasio-Cortez," Judge Forrester cut in, voice flat but firm, "the court is well aware of the ruling in Holder. You may move on." She didn't flinch. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the relevance of Holder is foundational to this motion. The facts parallel our case in critical ways." "This is not Indiana," he snapped. She held his gaze now, not defiantly, but without retreat. "No, it's not. But federal interpretation doesn't dissolve at the state line. In Holder, the court held that arrests made without proper notice, particularly where protesters had no clear verbal warning, failed to meet constitutional standards for lawful removal." She turned a page, calmly, slowly. "In that case, the building was open to commercial foot traffic, no fences, no signage, Just an implied boundary that the court determined could not supersede the First Amendment? The same applies here. Forrester's knuckles tapped the bench once, sharp and loud. "You've made your point," he said, but there was something taut in his jaw now, something less certain. "I've made a portion of it," AOC replied evenly, "and only because the record should reflect more than conclusions. It should reflect reasoning." In the gallery, a reporter's pen scratched faster. 2 rows back, a man in a navy blazer whispered, "She's not letting go." A few seats away, the prosecutor, Leland Briggs, leaned forward with a practiced air of exhaustion. "Your Honor," he said with a performative sigh, "we're not here to relitigate obscure federal rulings. The Congresswoman is stretching precedent so far it's going to snap." Alexandria turned toward him slowly, not unlike someone adjusting a microscope, measured, focused. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "did you read the Holder ruling in full, or are you referring to the 3-line summary in the Westlaw Digest?" He stiffened. "I've read the opinion." "Then you'll recall that the court emphasized clarity of instruction and intent. Officer Walsh gave neither. There was no audible warning, no time to comply, and no lawful directive to vacate a space that was publicly accessible. That matters." Forrester leaned back slightly, eyes flicking toward Briggs but not lingering. He said nothing. Alexandria pressed forward. "The law does not protect comfort, it protects rights. My clients were not trespassing. They were seated in silence on open steps reading. That may have been inconvenient to someone inside, but it was not illegal." Forrester glanced down at his docket again, but slower now. The first interruption had come quickly, the second with less certainty. The third had not arrived at all. Alexandria returned her gaze to the bench. She had not raised her voice. She had not moved her hands. But the room had shifted again, and everyone knew it. She wasn't stretching the law. She was reintroducing it to people who'd gotten too comfortable ignoring it. The words settled like dust, slow and heavy. For a second, no one seemed to breathe. Judge Forrester stared down from the bench, unmoving, as if waiting for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to pull back, to soften, to give him a thread of humility to grab onto. But she didn't blink. She had just said it, clear, deliberate, louder in meaning than in volume. The Constitution doesn't stretch, it holds. And today it's holding them. Them, her clients, the 6 protesters seated quietly behind her, their hands folded, their eyes down. Not threats, not agitators, citizens, the kind the law was supposed to serve, not silence. Forrester shifted in his chair, his robe rustling softly as he sat forward. "Ms. Ocasio-Cortez," he said, drawing out each syllable, "this court does not appreciate rhetorical games disguised as legal reasoning." She kept her gaze level. "There's no game, Your Honor, just structure. And the structure is what's being challenged, not by me, but by these charges." The tension in the room thickened. Someone near the back cleared their throat but quickly stopped, as though afraid of the sound. The bailiff moved slightly, one boot grinding against the tile. Even the hum of the fluorescent light seemed fainter, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Forrester's voice tightened. "If you continue down this path, I will not hesitate to issue another contempt citation. You're treading dangerously close to the line." Alexandria's reply was quiet but unflinching. "The only line I'm approaching is the one this court drew around itself the moment it chose to criminalize presence." Gasps weren't audible anymore. The room had stopped reacting in noise and started reacting in posture. Shoulders tensed, eyes locked forward. Every pair of lungs held just enough air to avoid trembling. The shift was happening, subtle but seismic. At the very back of the gallery, a young journalist named Layla adjusted her laptop in her lap and began typing furiously. She hadn't expected much from this hearing. A routine dismissal attempt, a few procedural objections, a quote or two for the article. But now, this wasn't procedure anymore. This was pressure, and pressure made news. She typed, "AOC pushes courtroom to edge. Judge threatens citation. Defense unmoved." Judge Forrester pressed his lips together, a hard line drawn beneath a face trying not to betray frustration. He looked down at the docket, then back up at her. "Final warning." AOC nodded slightly. "Understood." But there was something about the way she said it, something not quite submissive. It wasn't agreement, it wasn't apology, it was acknowledgement that she had heard him, that she would continue anyway. Because what hung in the air wasn't defiance, it was pressure. Not the kind that bursts quickly, but the kind that cracks slowly, precisely from within. In the row behind her, Daryl Jenkins sat straighter, one hand still close to his chest. Marissa closed her eyes briefly, her lips moving soundlessly. A student shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying not to fidget, but visibly shaking. They weren't lawyers. They weren't trained for this, but they knew instinctively that something rare was unfolding in front of them. The judge picked up his pen. He didn't write. AOC turned another page in her binder. The room didn't move, because now everyone wondered the same thing. Would she bend? Would she break? Would the pressure finally push her back? But she didn't. She stood, one heel slightly angled outward, a posture not of challenge, but of certainty. And in that posture, still, centered, undeterred, was her answer. She wasn't the one under pressure. She was the pressure. The courtroom had grown unnaturally still. Even the old wooden benches, usually creaking under restless weight, had gone silent. Judge Forrester sat back in his chair, shoulders tight beneath the dark folds of his robe, pen resting idly between two fingers. Across the room, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez flipped a page in her binder. Not quickly, not with theatrical flair, but with a kind of precision that signaled something important was coming. Your Honor, she said, in support of our motion, I'd like to introduce one additional case into the record. Donovan v. Metro PD, 9th Circuit, 2016. A flicker passed over Forrester's face. The name was unfamiliar, or at least unmemorable. It hadn't been cited in any recent filings. It didn't come up in the state database summaries. He leaned slightly forward, not enough to signal curiosity, but just enough to betray it. Objection, Briggs said from the prosecution table too quickly. That case was dismissed on procedural grounds. It holds no precedential weight. AOC didn't turn toward him. She kept her eyes on the judge. He's correct, she said. The case was dismissed before a final ruling could establish precedent. But the language used in the appellate opinion was clear, firm, and relevant. If I may read directly. Forrester didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, then at Briggs, then at the clock behind the gallery. Make it brief, he said, tapping his pen once on the bench. AOC nodded and slid a single sheet from the back of her binder. She held it delicately like something that didn't look important until it was. In Donovan versus Metro PD, she began, her voice steady but layered with weight. The court wrote the following in its dismissal opinion, and I quote, "While we do not reach a ruling on the constitutionality of the arrest in question, we express grave concern over the use of vague, inaudible commands as justification for immediate physical escalation during peaceful protest. Such practice edges dangerously close to criminalizing silence itself." She looked up. The words hovered in the room, quiet but resonant. It was not thunder, it was echo. Judge Forrester didn't move, but something in his expression shifted, the faint crease between his eyebrows deepening, the line of his mouth relaxing by the slightest fraction. He didn't look surprised by the quote. He looked unsettled by how well it applied. AOC continued, letting the silence stretch just enough. Officer Walsh claimed 3 verbal warnings, she said. The video shows one, barely audible over street noise, before immediate physical contact. No megaphone, no clear dispersal order, and no visible attempt to ensure compliance before escalation. She held the page up slightly as though offering it to the room. If the concern raised in Donovan isn't addressed here, then we are accepting a precedent by omission, that officers may bypass constitutional thresholds simply by murmuring commands and calling them sufficient. Briggs leaned forward, exasperated. Again, Your Honor, that case was dismissed. It doesn't apply. AOC turned to him at last. Then let's not pretend I'm citing it for its conclusion. I'm citing it for its reasoning, for the concern it articulates, one this court now shares jurisdiction over. She turned back to Forrester. That paragraph was never meant to be final, but it was meant to be heard. Forrester didn't speak. Not yet. He ran his thumb along the edge of his docket. He wasn't convinced, but he was listening. And in a courtroom that had tried, again and again, to cut her off, that above all was progress. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't look at the prosecution table when she asked the question. She didn't need to. "Mr. Briggs," she said, lifting her eyes only after a long pause, "did you watch the video?" Leland Briggs shifted in his seat. The question caught him mid-page, his pen still hovering above a yellow legal pad. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. A pause, too long for comfort. "I've reviewed the incident reports," he replied, his voice clipped, slightly defensive. "The department provided a comprehensive—" "That wasn't my question." A murmur spread across the gallery like a ripple in glass. "I asked," AOC repeated, "if you watched the video? The footage submitted as part of the defense's initial motion?" Briggs swallowed, visibly recalibrating. "No," he admitted. "I was focused on the documentation provided by law enforcement." AOC nodded slightly, as though expecting nothing else. She turned to Judge Forrester. "Then I'd like to enter a brief segment of that footage into the record and request permission to play it for the court." Forrester hesitated, just for a second. Then quietly, "Granted." The bailiff moved toward the evidence station, inserting a USB drive labeled simply Exhibit C, Northern Star footage. The monitor embedded in the courtroom wall flickered once, then came to life in a blur of static and muffled sound. The video began, time-stamped and steady, filmed from across the street. Traffic sounds dominated the first few seconds. Passing cars, footsteps, the faint rustle of wind against signage. The protesters were seated peacefully on the steps of the Northern Star Energy Building, legs crossed, signs folded in their laps. In the center, Marissa Elkins held a paperback open in both hands, reading calmly. No chants, no shouting, just her voice, carrying gently above the noise. "When the people stand in silence, their stillness unsettles the powerful more than the loudest cries ever could," she read. Then just off-screen, Officer Walsh stepped into frame. AOC leaned toward the monitor and raised her voice, not in volume, but in clarity. "The officer begins speaking here," she said, gesturing at the timestamp. 10:41 a.m. The court listened. Walsh's voice was low, nearly swallowed by traffic. "You are hereby ordered to disperse." That was all anyone could make out. Then he stepped forward. No delay, no megaphone, no effort to verify they'd heard him. His hand reached down and yanked the first seated protester up by the arm. The man stumbled, startled. Walsh moved on. Timestamp, 10:41, 12 a.m. 4 seconds, AOC said calmly, from his first audible word to his first act of physical escalation. The screen froze on Marissa, mid-sentence, her mouth open as Walsh's hand closed around her wrist. The book she had been reading dropped to the ground, splaying open on the concrete. "She was quoting Angela Davis when he grabbed her," AOC said. "No threat, no movement, no chance to comply, just silence, and then force." Briggs looked down now, no longer writing. Forrester didn't move. AOC turned to the judge, her tone still steady. "Officer Walsh claimed in 3 separate reports that he gave multiple loud verbal warnings before making contact. The video contradicts that entirely. It shows one vague statement, barely audible, followed by immediate arrest. No PA system, no follow-up, no intention to de-escalate." She let the moment stretch, then said softly, "And this is what they call lawful?" The room said nothing. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the footage had already said everything. For a full 5 seconds after the screen went dark, no one spoke. No one shuffled. Even the bailiff, who had returned to his post near the chamber door, kept his hands clasped behind his back without the usual subtle fidget. Judge Randall Forrester sat still as stone. The courtroom, once governed by routine, motions, objections, citations, now existed entirely in the pause. Forrester adjusted the glasses on the bridge of his nose, then looked toward the clerk. "Play it again," he said, voice low but clear. There was no commentary this time, no framing. The room didn't need explanation. The facts had already walked in and taken their seats. The screen flickered back to life. Same timestamp, same moment. The protesters seated calmly, the city's noise humming along as background music, to an act of quiet resistance. Marissa's voice, mid-quote, soft but steady, spoke above the hum. Their stillness unsettles the powerful. Then again the officer entered. 4 seconds, someone in the back whispered, not loud enough to draw objection, but just enough to remind everyone that the clock didn't lie. This time Forrester leaned forward. It was subtle, just his elbows shifting onto the edge of the bench, his fingertips steepling beneath his chin. But it was the most movement he had made in 20 minutes, and it changed the posture of the room. He wasn't issuing commands anymore. He was watching. His face didn't soften. His mouth remained taut, a thin line refusing to betray thought. But behind the stern expression, something had cracked. Not broken, not yet, but cracked, like the faint sound of tension in old wood under pressure. And across the aisle, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't move. She didn't elaborate. She didn't speak at all. Her silence wasn't strategic. It was structural. Because once the truth was visible, once it had unspooled in front of them frame by frame, she no longer needed to argue it. She just needed to let it exist. In the back row, Nico leaned forward slightly, his notepad untouched in his lap. His voice barely registered above the quiet, more breath than sound. "She's not arguing," he whispered. "She's revealing." The court reporter paused in her transcription for half a beat, just long enough to look up and glance toward the bench. It wasn't procedure that was happening now. It was something else entirely. On screen, Marissa's wrist was pulled upward again. The book fell. The protester beside her stood slowly, confused, his hands raised in uncertainty, before another officer grabbed his shoulder. No one had shouted. No one had resisted. Forrester drew in a slow breath, then exhaled through his nose. He reached for a folder, his own notes, and opened it, though he didn't look down. His fingers merely rested there, as if unsure whether to continue or simply acknowledge what everyone had just seen. When the video stopped, silence returned. But it wasn't awkward, it was weighted. AOC finally looked up, not to speak, but to meet Forrester's eyes. Just a glance, not defiant, not challenging, just unwavering. He looked back. For the first time since the hearing began, he didn't see a headline-seeking politician. He didn't see a disruptor or an ideologue. He saw something far more dangerous to the balance he was used to maintaining. He saw someone whose case didn't need volume. It had structure, and that structure was holding. Still silent, Forrester closed the folder in front of him, but the sound it made, soft as it was, carried like a gavel. Judge Forrester's fingers moved with mechanical precision, flipping page after page in the thick case folder that had sat mostly untouched since the hearing began. The courtroom remained still, its collective breath held beneath layers of quiet expectation. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from confusion. It was the kind that followed exposure. The video had done something no argument could. It had shifted the courtroom's emotional gravity, and everyone was waiting to see where it would land. AOC stood poised at the defense table, her notes organized, her posture calm. She wasn't watching the judge now. She didn't have to. She'd already placed every piece where it needed to be. The next move belonged to him. Forrester turned another page, then another. Then he stopped. The pause was subtle, half a second longer between turns, but it carried weight. His eyes narrowed slightly. He lifted a single sheet from the file, holding it between his fingers, as if weighing its thickness might explain what was written on it. He adjusted his glasses and read aloud. At the time of the protest, the building entrances were not obstructed and no physical damage was observed. Protesters remained seated on the front steps and did not interfere with foot traffic or business operations. Police were not requested by property management, but appeared after a phone call from a private tenant on the 5th floor. There was no reaction at first, not from him, not from the prosecution table, not even from the gallery. Then, just a beat later, everyone froze. Briggs looked up sharply from his notes, as if the sentence had caught him mid-thought and yanked him backward. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," he said quickly. "Could you clarify the source of that statement?" Forrester didn't look at him. "It's an affidavit," he replied, "filed by Gerard Blanche, senior property manager of Northern Star Energy, dated the morning after the arrest." AOC glanced at her assistant, but said nothing. She had read it twice already. She had been waiting for this moment, not to reveal it herself, but to let him find it. It mattered more that way. Briggs cleared his throat. That was submitted with the initial packet, yes, but it wasn't emphasized. It doesn't alter the legality of— It does, Forrester interrupted, his voice no longer taut but sharp. It absolutely does, because it means Officer Walsh escalated a situation without direction from the building's ownership or management. He looked up now, finally meeting AOC's eyes. There was no accusation there, just something cautious, something bordering on reluctant curiosity. "You knew this was in here," he said, not a question. AOC nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We submitted our response after reviewing the affidavit, but the prosecution did not acknowledge it in any of their objections." Briggs opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked down, flipping through his own copy of the case file with less confidence than before. Forrester leaned back slightly, the affidavit still in his hand. He read the sentence again to himself, silently this time. Each word seemed to etch itself deeper into the fabric of the case. Police were not requested by property management. The implications were immediate and damning. This wasn't a matter of trespass. It wasn't even a matter of failed warnings. It was a matter of uninvited force, responding not to a complaint from those with legal authority over the premises, but from a single tenant uncomfortable with what he saw outside his window. Forrester tapped the edge of the affidavit against the bench once, softly. This wasn't the defense spinning a narrative. This was the record telling the truth, and that, more than any argument, was beginning to shake the foundation beneath his bench. Judge Forrester didn't speak immediately. He kept the affidavit in his hand, eyes fixed on the last two lines like he was seeing them for the first time, even though, technically, he wasn't. The document had been part of the initial evidence packet. It had passed across his desk, under his pen, through his clerk's inbox. But it hadn't registered until now. Not fully. Not with the weight it deserved. The gallery was quiet, leaning forward without meaning to. The defense table remained motionless. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood with the same stillness she had worn since the morning session began. Her posture hadn't changed, but the space around her had. Where there had once been resistance, there was now uncertainty. Where there had been doubt, there was now a growing sense of inevitability. Forrester read the line one more time, out loud this time, slower. Police were not requested by property management. He glanced back at Briggs. So who exactly called for enforcement action? Briggs adjusted his tie. According to supplemental records, a tenant on the 5th floor, a private consultant. We have a name, but he wasn't part of the affidavit. He claimed the protest was disruptive. Forrester's eyes narrowed. Disruptive? How? Briggs faltered. He said he heard voices through his window, thought it might become hostile, claimed it could deter clients. But the affidavit, AOC interjected smoothly, from the actual property manager contradicts that narrative entirely. It states no entrances were blocked, no damage occurred, no business was interrupted, and critically that no one from management requested police presence. She stepped forward just half a pace, enough to signify movement without crossing any line. What this affidavit reveals, Your Honor, is not just a detail, it's a motive. The arrests weren't in defense of property. They were in defense of comfort, the comfort of one tenant who mistook peaceful assembly for danger and triggered a chain reaction of overreach. Briggs raised his voice. That doesn't make the protest legal. No, AOC replied, but it exposes the state's response as disproportionate. And when the state exercises its power to remove citizens, not because of law, but because of fear, we are no longer discussing trespass. We're discussing suppression. Forrester's jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger. This time it was different. Something behind his eyes had changed. A shadow of doubt had taken root. The kind that creeps in not when you think someone else is lying, but when you suspect you've believed something too quickly. He glanced again at the affidavit. He flipped back 2 pages, then forward 3, scanning, searching for some contradiction that might soften what had now hardened into fact. The protest didn't block entrances. There was no physical damage, no interference with foot traffic, no request from those responsible for the building. Yet 6 people were arrested for sitting, for speaking, for existing too publicly, too visibly in a space someone else didn't want them to occupy. The courtroom seemed to inhale as one. AOC spoke again, her voice low, steady. If the court doesn't question the origin of force, it validates it. If we ignore who called and why, then we're saying any voice, no matter how privileged, how distant, can weaponize the system against those who have none. Forrester didn't respond, but his silence had a different tone now. It wasn't power asserting itself. It was power reevaluating. And outside, where the sun angled through the high windows, the shadows on the floor had begun to shift, like the truth was finally moving with the light. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words landed in the courtroom with more force than a shout ever could. Measured, precise, inevitable. They weren't arrested for breaking laws, she said, her tone calm but resolute. They were arrested for breaking comfort. The sentence settled over the room like dust in sunlight, slow, visible, impossible to ignore. Every syllable carried a different weight now. The earlier interruptions, the contempt citation, the judge's stiff posture, it had all led to this moment. And in that single line, AOC had distilled the entire hearing down to its most essential truth. The silence that followed wasn't confused. It was clarified. Briggs, clearly rattled, tried to jump in. Your Honor, the defense is assigning motives without foundation. This is a matter of property law, not political speculation. But the words sounded thin, like scaffolding around a building that had already collapsed. AOC turned slightly to face him. Mr. Briggs, I'm not speculating. I'm citing an affidavit your own office submitted, which clearly states there was no property damage, no business disruption, and no request for police intervention from the party legally responsible for the premises. She took a step back toward the defense table, anchoring herself again. What remains, she continued, is one tenant's discomfort, interpreted as threat, and 6 people punished, not because of what they did, but because of what someone feared they might do. That isn't trespass, that's targeting. Briggs fumbled for composure. Intent is irrelevant when the law is broken. The law, she replied evenly, was not broken. It was bent to fit a narrative, one that turns a seated protest into a provocation and a moment of silence into grounds for arrest. Forrester rubbed his brow slowly, the affidavit still resting in front of him, his fingers pressed against the crease between his eyes as if trying to push back a headache, or perhaps the realization that something was unraveling under his watch. The courtroom grew quieter than it had ever been. Not still. Quiet. The kind of quiet that lives in recognition. The clerk stopped typing. The bailiff didn't move. The journalists in the gallery had long since stopped looking for quotes. They were now just listening. Darrell Jenkins shifted in his seat behind AOC, eyes wide but focused. Marissa stared down at her hands, lips pressed together, breathing through her nose. The young college student who had barely spoken a word since the arrest looked up for the first time and met the judge's gaze. Not accusingly, but openly, human to human, as if asking, "Do you see it now?" Forrester let out a slow exhale. His hand dropped from his brow to the bench, flat and steady. But he didn't reach for the gavel. He didn't speak. He looked at the affidavit again, just once, then closed the folder. AOC folded her notes neatly and placed them on the table in front of her, but remained standing. Her presence wasn't performance. It was proof. Discomfort, she said softly, almost as an afterthought, is not a legal threshold for removing someone from public space. And if it becomes one, then justice isn't being served. It's being shielded. No one replied, because there was nothing left to argue. The courtroom had stopped trying to fight her reasoning and had begun, slowly, to absorb it. Judge Randall Forrester sat still, his gavel untouched, his bench quiet. The courtroom had become less a place of procedure and more a theater of reckoning. Not dramatic, not loud, but heavy, like a verdict that had already begun writing itself. The kind that doesn't wait for the gavel to fall. He turned to the printed docket. Not the motions, not the affidavits or citations or timelines, just the names. He read them one by one, slow and deliberate, his voice no longer detached. Marissa Elkins, the school teacher. Arrested mid-sentence, a paperback still on the pavement where she'd dropped it. Daryl Jenkins, the community health nurse, the only one who asked calmly if they could be allowed to finish their reading before leaving. His question was ignored. Liana Kim, Ty Ramirez, Clarabelle James, Ruben Stahl. 6 names, 6 stories. None of them dangerous, none of them armed, none of them shouting or blocking doorways or vandalizing property. They sat, they read, they were removed. Forrester looked up from the page, slower than before, as if every name weighed a little heavier in his throat than the last. "You're asking for full dismissal?" he asked, finally meeting AOC's eyes again. She didn't blink. "No, Your Honor," she said gently but clearly. "I'm asking the court to recognize the line between protest and persecution." She let that hang, not like a challenge, more like a reminder, a quiet recentering of what the law is supposed to be. "These individuals didn't cross that line," she continued. "They didn't yell, didn't resist, didn't damage anything. They sat, they read, they exercised their constitutional rights with more restraint than many of us could manage in their place. And for that, they were arrested." She stepped forward now, but just one step. Her voice still soft, still calm, but filled with that quiet, grounded force that never seemed to need permission. "If this court upholds their charges, it signals that peace itself can be punished if it's inconvenient, that silence can be criminalized if it's uncomfortable, that protest, even when lawful and nonviolent, can be disappeared if the right person dials the wrong number." Judge Forrester said nothing for a moment. His thumb hovered over the edge of the bench, brushing its grain, like he was feeling his way back toward the center of something he'd lost track of. He looked down again at the names: Marissa, Daryl, Liana, Ty, Clarabelle, Ruben. They were more than defendants now. They were fixed points in a moment that might outlast the courtroom. Briggs shifted in his seat but didn't speak. His case had deflated, not from lack of effort, but from lack of weight. No statute could shield it now. The floor had shifted beneath it. AOC stepped back to the defense table, folding her hands in front of her. Her client sat behind her, eyes wide but calm, waiting not just for a ruling, but for recognition. And in that pause, before the next word, before the gavel, before the law decided what it would mean today, Forrester did something he hadn't done since the proceedings began. He looked not at the attorneys, not at the paperwork, not even at AOC. He looked directly at the 6 people in the gallery, and for the first time, he didn't see protesters. He saw citizens. For a long moment, Judge Forrester didn't speak. His hands, once so quick to gesture and point, now rested still against the polished wood of the bench. The room was holding its breath, though no one would admit it. The bailiff stood straighter. The prosecutor blinked rapidly. AOC waited without a twitch. Then came the shift. Forrester looked up and said, almost conversationally, "Holder V, Community Network." AOC gave the smallest nod, prepared but unhurried. "You wrote a memo on it, didn't you?" he asked. She met his gaze. "I did." Forrester leaned back slightly. "It came across my desk last year. Anonymous submission. I remember thinking, here's someone trying to argue that silence is louder than disruption. At the time, I thought it was poetic nonsense." He tapped a finger once against the folder in front of him. "I didn't know it was you." A murmur rippled through the back row. Nico, still scribbling notes, paused mid-sentence. The journalist in the corner stopped typing. AOC didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence worked for her now. Forrester glanced at the paperwork again, but his voice remained steady. "You didn't yell," he said, "but you didn't bend either." He opened the folder. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately, over the contents, as if confirming what he'd already decided. Then he began reading, not to perform, but to record. "This court finds that the 6 defendants, Marissa Elkins, Daryl Jenkins, Liana Kim, Ty Ramirez, Clarabelle James, and Ruben Stahl, were not in violation of criminal trespass statutes as defined by municipal code." Briggs shifted slightly, his jaw tight. He didn't interrupt. Forrester continued. "There is insufficient evidence that these individuals disrupted commercial operations or refused lawful directives. The arresting officers did not meet the legal threshold for dispersal warnings as established by prior rulings, including Holderveer Community Network and Donovan Beer of Metro PD.AOC blinked once, slowly. Her clients behind her remained frozen in their seats, disbelief and relief dancing wordlessly across their faces. Forrester placed both palms flat on the bench. Accordingly, all charges against the defendants are dismissed, with prejudice. It landed like a thunderclap wrapped in velvet. There was no cheer, no gasp, just a visceral shift. Like a burden the room didn't know it had been carrying had suddenly dropped through the floor. Forrester wasn't finished. He looked down at another page, thinner, lighter, but heavier in its symbolism. As for the earlier contempt citation levied against Representative Ocasio-Cortez, this court recognizes that, while her statements were pointed, they remained within professional and constitutional bounds. The citation is hereby rescinded. The fine, like the charges, was gone. AOC exhaled gently. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was precision, just like her memo, just like her argument, just like her silence. Judge Forrester closed the folder. "You argued law," he said plainly, "but with something almost close to respect. And you did so without making it about yourself. That used to be rare in this room." She said nothing. Her clients behind her began to shift, shoulders loosening, breaths returning to normal. Darrell lowered his head into his hands, overcome not with drama, but with the quiet release of dignity restored. Forrester lifted the gavel. The room tensed, but not in fear this time, in reverence. He brought it down once, crack, sharp, clean, final. And with that, the courtroom let go. The gavel's crack still hung in the air, like the aftershock of a distant strike. Not loud, not sudden, just decisive enough to announce that the system had, for once, pulled back from the edge. But no one clapped. AOC didn't move right away. She didn't flinch, didn't nod, didn't pump a fist. She simply reached forward, slid her folder closed with a firm, quiet hand, and stood still. Her clients were already turning to her, but she didn't turn yet. She kept her eyes on the bench, on Forrester, not in confrontation, but in confirmation, like she was making sure the decision would stick. Behind her, the 6 protesters began to exhale, but cautiously, as if permission to feel relief hadn't quite been granted. Marissa pressed her lips together, as though smiling would break the dignity of the moment. Reuben blinked quickly, his hands tightening around his phone, but he didn't look at it. He wasn't ready to text anyone. Not yet. Ty gave a short, soft breath that sounded almost like laughter, but it wasn't. It was disbelief, restrained and buried under days of anxiety. Even the bailiff, who had watched AOC like she was a problem to be contained, seemed to shift weight more thoughtfully now. Not sympathetic, but slower, like the edges had softened. The wooden door at the back creaked slightly. The sound felt almost inappropriate. Nico sat frozen in the second row, his notebook open across his lap, pen halfway through a sentence he no longer remembered starting. He leaned sideways toward the older journalist beside him, whispering out of the corner of his mouth, That's what justice sounds like?" The older man didn't answer. He just tapped at his tablet absently, lost in his own thoughts. AOC finally turned, not triumphantly, but with that same stillness she'd carried since the moment Forrester challenged her. She leaned over the rail where her assistant stood, expression unreadable. Nico, still watching, saw her lips move. Not for the cameras, not for the court, but for those close enough to hear. "No," she said quietly. "That's what it looks like when it almost doesn't arrive." Her voice wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. But it carried the weight of something personal, like she'd seen this before, too many times to be surprised, but never enough to get used to it. The protesters rose from their bench slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that standing too quickly might wake the system up again. Clarabelle touched AOC's sleeve, whispered, "Thank you," but didn't linger. Briggs had already started gathering his papers in sharp, clipped movements. He didn't speak to anyone as he left. The courtroom hadn't turned hostile. It had simply moved past him. Forrester stood, not for dramatic effect, but with the motion of someone concluding something internal. He didn't look back at AOC as he exited through the judge's door. But he didn't need to. Something had shifted between them. Not friendship, not agreement, just recognition. Nico kept writing, words now flowing faster. His headline still hadn't formed in his mind, but the shape of it was there. Not about a courtroom victory, not about contempt fines or citations reversed. It was something quieter, a win without applause, a moment when silence wasn't defeat, but proof that someone had finally listened. AOC moved toward the door with her team, the folder under her arm as if it held no more than scraps of paper. But Nico knew better now. Sometimes, he thought, justice didn't roar. Sometimes it whispered, and dared the room to stay still enough to hear it. The heavy doors closed behind them with a soft finality. No press conference, no swarm of reporters. Just a long, echoing hallway lined with brass plaques and flickering lights, where breath finally came easier. Marissa was the first to reach her. She didn't ask permission. She just wrapped her arms around AOC and held on. Not for show, not to be brave, but because holding was safer than speaking. AOC let her. No awkwardness, no pat on the back. Just stillness, like the hug had been waiting to happen for days. Reuben leaned against the wall, wiping his forehead with a folded handkerchief. "I still can't believe it," he muttered. "I was convinced we'd get community service at best." Daryl stood a few feet away, arms crossed, not angry, just processing. He looked at AOC as if seeing her differently now, like the label Congresswoman had melted away and left something steel underneath. "I thought I'd get a record," he said half to himself, "for sitting down." AOC turned to him. Her voice was low, but it carried. "You didn't break the law," she said. "You broke silence." That stopped him. He gave a short laugh, but it wasn't bitter. It was surprised and grateful. He didn't respond, just nodded, like the words needed time to settle. Claribel checked her phone, then looked up. "The video's circulating again," she said quietly. "Someone posted a side-by-side, arrest footage and courtroom clips. It's moving fast." Marissa broke her silence. "Will it matter?" she asked, not cynically, but like someone who'd seen too many fires put out with press releases. AOC's eyes didn't blink. "Not to everyone, not all at once, but to some, yes. To the ones who needed to know they weren't wrong for caring." They started walking toward the elevator. No parade, no spotlight. Just a group of people who'd fought for a paragraph in a law book to mean something, and won, however narrowly. Nico trailed a few paces behind. He'd stayed quiet most of the time, notebook in hand, absorbing. But now he sped up just enough to fall in beside AOC. "Your line, back in there, about almost missing justice. That was off the cuff?" She didn't slow her step. Number it was lived. He nodded slowly, jotting that down without breaking stride. Ty hit the elevator button, and the doors pinged open. They stepped in together, packed shoulder to shoulder. No titles, no hierarchy. Just 7 people who had shared a battle that didn't make the news until it became undeniable. Inside the elevator, no one spoke. The soft hum of motion filled the space. AOC stared straight ahead. Her hands were clasped lightly in front of her, folder now tucked under one arm, untouched since the ruling. The floor display blinked. 4, 3, 2. At ground level, the door slid open. Outside, the air was different, cooler, sharper, freer. The sidewalk was mostly empty, but someone had left a handmade sign against the courthouse steps. It read, "We sat down so others could stand up." No signature, just marker on cardboard. Reuben saw it first. He didn't say anything, just smiled for the first time all day. AOC stepped into the light without raising her hand or turning to the cameras. She didn't need to. The echo had already begun. The sky outside turned the color of pressed marigolds, dipping slowly into twilight. Streetlights blinked to life one by one as the noise of the day softened into the hush of late evening. Inside the small cafe on 137th and Lenox, the world felt far away. AOC sat across from Nico at a weathered corner table by the window. Her blazer was off, sleeves rolled to her forearms, a chipped mug of black coffee cooling between her palms. Nico nursed a ginger tea he hadn't touched in 10 minutes. His notepad sat open, blank. He hadn't written a word since they sat down. He looked up, hesitant. Can I ask you something off the record? She nodded without hesitation. He tapped his pen nervously. How do you stay calm when they talk down to you? Interrupt, roll their eyes, insult your intelligence like it's policy. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You learn not to confuse noise with volume. He blinked. What do you mean? AOC leaned in slightly. Her voice was even, almost quiet. You don't beat power by shouting. You beat it by knowing what it fears most. Nico waited. She sipped her coffee. Facts, she said finally. Receipts, logic, discipline. The thing they call calm is just control. And control, she added, scares the hell out of men who expect chaos. Nico didn't write that down either. He just looked out the window. The courthouse was only 6 blocks away, but it already felt like a different planet. Outside, the neon flickered to life. Open late. Inside, the fight wasn't over, but for a moment they rested, together and ready. The street had emptied, but the sidewalk hadn't. As AOC and Nico stepped away from the cafe, dust stretched long shadows across the pavement. A soft breeze carried distant sirens and closer laughter. Somewhere, a bus hissed to a stop. Somewhere else, history was still deciding if it had just been made. Then 2 girls walked past, maybe 16, maybe 17, shoulders squared, steps sure, homemade protest signs tucked under their arms like shields. One said in looping black marker, "We're not going away." They didn't stop to speak. They didn't have to. One gave AOC a nod, barely more than a glance, and then they disappeared down the street, silhouettes against the last bit of gold in the sky. AOC watched them go for a beat. Then she turned slightly, speaking more to the air than to anyone in particular. They don't need to know what I did, she said. They just need to know the rules protect them now. Nico walked beside her, quiet at first until the question returned like a reflex. You ever get tired? She didn't answer right away. They passed a street lamp just flickering on, casting a soft ring around their steps. All the time, she said at last, her voice low but unwavering, then softer, almost as if to herself. But I get more tired when no one shows up. They kept walking, past the courthouse, past the cafe, past the weight of the day that now rested behind them. No cameras, no speeches, just footprints moving forward, steady and real. And in that moment, with the sky turning from gold to violet, it was clear. This wasn't the end. It was how the next part begins. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.